and my remarks will be short as well. And so given that I have only a short paper here of comments, I'm going to take a little bit of time beyond the comments just to have everyone thank both Mike, Rappaport and Ramsey, for putting on this conference. I think I run an institute myself. I put on conferences. I know how much goes into it, and so thank you guys. And in absentia, we should thank their administrative assistant, Leilani Sherritt, who's also my administrative assistant, and I know how much work she puts into the logistics of all of this. So, Leilani, thank you. You can hold your applause. She won't hear it. And also, I wanted to thank, just as a participant in this, I wanted to thank all of you for making this a very rich and constructive gathering. And I just want to say, as just a point of personal pride here, several years ago, and then for continually thereafter, I thought that given both the number and the quality of people at our law school who were either practitioners of or theorists of originalism or both, that there ought to be some way of organizing them and calling attention to that particular strength of the law school. Because I'm running another institute, I really didn't have the time to put in, but Mike have stepped up to the plate and have made this a reality. And so I personally am quite proud of what they have accomplished. So that's by way of using some of my time. So I'm going to talk about Larry's paper, and my comments are just solely on the interpretation, construction, distinction. So Larry's paper succinctly sets forth his view of the distinction between legal interpretation and legal construction, a distinction that figures prominently in recent debates about constitutional interpretation, but one that actually transcends constitutional law and can apply to many kinds of legal texts. Legal interpretation for Solem is recovery of the text's linguistic meaning. It is an empirical undertaking, the quarry of which might be the text's authorially intended meaning, which is my view, or the text's original public meaning, his view. By the way, authorially intended meaning is different from authorially intended applications. And I keep hearing this conflation. Intended applications, what people foresaw as applications, is evidence of, but not constitutive of, authorially intended meaning. Now, for the interpretation-construction distinction, this difference over the quarry of interpretation is mostly, though not entirely, irrelevant. Construction, on the other hand, begins where interpretation ends. On Solem's account, construction takes place when the linguistic meaning of the text is translated into legal doctrine. Although sometimes there is a one-to-one correspondence between linguistic meaning and legal doctrine, such as with the provision of the Constitution that mandates 2 senators from each state, often construction of legal doctrine requires going beyond the linguistic meaning of the text and thus beyond interpretation. Solem gives several examples where construction comes into play: the multitude of free speech doctrines invoked by courts as constitutional law cannot, he argues, be read off the linguistic meaning of the First Amendment, nor does linguistic meaning help when the Constitution is silent or when linguistic meanings contradict one another. Most importantly, perhaps, vague terms cannot be employed in legal doctrine without construction. Now, just as interpretation is an essentially empirical matter, construction is ineluctably normative. It requires recourse to moral and political values. At this point, I'm going to turn critical. There's much in Solem's account with which I agree. I agree that interpretation is empirical, and I agree that some of what he calls construction is perforce normative. I think, however, that Solem has painted the interpretation-legal doctrine relation with too broad a brush. he needs more distinctions than he gives us. To begin with, we should distinguish legal doctrine in the courts from legal doctrine to cour. There is no question that when constitutional or statutory issues are raised in litigation, the courts will need ancillary doctrines to implement the linguistic meaning of the text, even if the meaning is clear. At a minimum, they will need rules about burdens of proof, a point driven home by Mitch Berman and Kermit Roosevelt, for example. And if the application of linguistic meaning to factual circumstances is at issue, the courts may need doctrines regarding how much, if at all, they should defer to the judgments of other governmental actors. Standards of review under the Equal Protection Clause, for example, are best viewed not as constructions of equal protection doctrine per se, but rather as court-focused doctrines regarding how courts should regard the acts of other governmental actors that are alleged to be violative of equal protection. It may be that a law struck down in the courts as violative of equal protection is struck down not because it is actually a violation of the clause, but because it cannot pass strict scrutiny. If strict scrutiny is a strong presumption that laws with certain features, such as racial classifications, violate the linguistic meaning of equal protection because, say, they are motivated by animus, then some laws that are not motivated by animus may be struck down because they run afoul of doctrines of judicial review, like strict scrutiny, but not because they run afoul of the linguistic meaning of the Equal Protection Clause. And to see this point more clearly, the U.S. Supreme Court, which is constitutionally forbidden from violating equal protection in, say, the hiring of its law clerks, would not apply strict scrutiny to its own actions. It would just apply the linguistic meaning of equal protection directly. So legal doctrine is not exactly the same thing as judicial doctrine constructed to implement legal doctrine. Still, Solem is correct that the latter definitely goes beyond linguistic meaning and hence interpretation. But his analysis runs the risk, I think, of effacing this particular distinction. Second, I agree with Solem that vague terms and vague norms, standards, call for normative reason in order to be implemented, whether they are being implemented by the courts or by other actors. Nonetheless, I believe that Solem gives up on interpretation a bit too soon. Perhaps this is where the difference between looking for original public meaning and looking for authorially intended meaning has some bite. A term may be vague if one is confined to its dictionary meaning, but not if one knows how the particular user of the term employs it. Take Solem's example of cool in the temperature sense. Solem says there is no obvious line separating cool from not cool. But suppose my mother asked me to keep the house cool, my mother asked me not to keep the house cool when she comes to visit. I know my mother is very sensitive to cold temperatures, and she complains about being cold whenever the thermostat at our house is set below 72 degrees. So 70 degrees would be cool in her vocabulary. On the other hand, our Danish visitors are uncomfortable if our thermostat is set above 65 degrees, so that for them, 70 degrees is quite warm. My point is that if one is looking for the authorially intended meaning of a term, phrase, or clause, a lot of vagueness can be eliminated by supplementing dictionary definitions with knowledge of the author's purposes, understandings, and usage patterns. This is not a point that should be controversial, and I expect Solem himself accepts it. Just as the necessity of construction due to vagueness may be overstated, because the degree of vagueness itself may be overstated, a favorite ploy of living constitutionalists, so too is the necessity of construction due to constitutional contradictions and lacunae often overstated. Contradictions may be resolved by interpretation if one has evidence that the authors intended one clause to trump the other in cases of conflict. And constitutional lacunae may frequently, though not always, be handled if recourse to statutory law or state law was the intended default position. In the end, Solem is correct. Interpretation cannot do all the work of constitutional law or statutory law. There will undoubtedly be some, perhaps many instances, where the lawmakers intended a vague standard and thus intended to delegate normative discretion to future authorities. There will probably be cases, hopefully few, where the lawmakers confusedly contradicted themselves by issuing contradictory norms and no intended algorithm for lexically ordering them can be discerned. There may be true gaps that cannot be filled by default provisions. and the courts will of necessity need doctrines regarding judicial review and burdens of proof. Still, if it is a mistake to minimize the necessity of construction, it is equally a mistake to overstate its role. The latter mistake leads to giving up on interpretation before its resources have been exhausted and provides a fig leaf for those who wish to alter the law rather than follow it. The end.